Hello, everyone. Can I firstly confirm that everyone can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you as the negative team.
Awesome. Side affirmative?
You're on affirmative.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the open grand final between two truly exceptional teams. We have ANU1 on side affirmative and Sydney1 on the negative. My name is Andrew Moore. I will be chairing this grand final. And firstly, I would like to congratulate both teams for getting this far, coming to the grand final and debating. So if you did not see before, the motion to be debated is that as environmentalists, we would choose a strategy of working closely with corporations. Without further delay, if no one has any questions, I invite the first affirmative to defend the motion in their name.
Cool. Can everyone hear me? Just checking.
Yes.
All right, great. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel. We live in a world where capitalist and corporate structures are deeply embedded in the folds of politics, social spheres, and a country's economy. Environmentalists standing in opposition to these structures are engaging in a futile fight that will only result in irreparable damage to the environment in the long run. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to look at what it means to work closely with these corporations. Secondly, I'm going to look at why we can't oppose these corporations. Thirdly, I'm going to look at what happens when we oppose these corporations. And finally, why we get changes under our side of the house. Obviously, we agree that we are not going to upend these structures entirely on our side, but we are more likely to get meaningful change, and that is compared to nothing that the negative brings to this debate. Okay, so what does working closely with corporations look like? Obviously, environmentalists have limited political capital in both worlds, so we think that we would spend our political capital working with these corporations instead of wholesale opposing them as structures, right? So what does this look like? 4 things. Firstly, it looks like trying to internally restructure corporations. That's restructuring them to be more environmentally friendly. That's to say, like spending money on getting them to restructure so that they say like don't dump waste in locations which are near like important environmental places, or like working to alter some of their practices. We'd say the things like dumping and polluting, which are particularly pernicious. Secondly, it looks like working with those corporations to show that there are benefits to being environmentally friendly and getting them to understand that there are actually beneficial economic models that come when you engage in environmentally friendly practices. Thirdly, it looks like, as a matter of principle, saying that they can be part of solutions and no longer saying that they are the evil in totality, and that we are unable to ever engage with them to have a good environmental system in the future. Fourthly, it looks like giving them consultants, buying shares in their companies, and we would say that this is particularly an important way to do it, because we've seen, like with CommBank in Australia, by buying majority shares in that corporation, shareholders were able to force that bank to release more greenhouse gas emission reports, and that's a huge benefit that's come working in within that structure. What does the opposition have to support? They have to support, firstly, not working closely with these groups, that's being in diametric opposition to them, and secondly, working closely with governments or perhaps other actors that they're going to put forward. Okay, so why does not working closely with them mean that we will never get change in the mainstream public? 4 reasons. Firstly, society corporate capture is something that cannot occur if you work against these corporations. That's because people like Enron, BP, JP Morgan's, large MNCs have huge political power to capture governments, and they currently have that, and they maintain that into the future. That's to say that they have lobbying capacities, which means they fund both political parties so that they have both in their pockets. That's to say that to the degree you need funding in any political system to penetrate portions of society, they will always have that ability to penetrate into those portions of society, particularly true in developing countries where most governments need to pander to companies to get foreign direct investment, to get employment. They are hugely powerful in these regions. Secondly, there's media capture that comes with those corporations. That's to say that media and companies often align. That's either because they're conservative in their political spectrum, that's to say that they're pro-business, often climate change skeptics, or because media houses are corporations themselves, corporate interests, or owned by parent companies, which themselves are also corporations. So we would either try to be working with these corporations or engaging with them. That's to say that like places like Tata in India, where they have media, broadcasting, and industrial power, are the sorts of groups we want to be working with. Thirdly, these corporations are embedded in the political, economic, and social structures. That's to say that corporations bring money to set up businesses, and like they often have a huge control in these sorts of regions. That's like to say that the residential area in Dhaka, Bashandra, is something that is named after a corporation. They have huge ties to these corporations, to these countries. There's a huge national pride and national identity with these sorts of places. That's to say, Petronas and Proton and Gojek in Malaysia and Indonesia have huge buy-in and huge support from the public. They're heavily tied to national identity in providing services as well. Given the current situation, we would say with economic recessions occurring, with large-scale unemployment, particularly with COVID-19, companies are seen as the groups who are currently the lifeline for people. They are the lifeline, particularly for those in developing countries where poverty is reigning. We think that it is incredibly important that we do not go against that narrative. We do not go against these corporations and antagonize them. What happens when you oppose these corporations? It's bad because of three things. Firstly, you incentivize them to be more antagonistic. Obviously, they're not our best friends straight away, but we think that there are more things that they do on the opposition side to harm the environment than they would under our side. That's to say that they run smear campaigns. That's to say they put more money and more funding into being anti-science, into being anti the environment, and to smearing specifically environmentalists and environmental studies which are pro evidence of climate change. This occurs when you impose the entire corporate structure, not when you try and work within it. We also think that you give them ammunition to say that environmentalists are elite white individuals who have like lots of money and come from the liberal left, who are uncompromising and do not have an understanding of the working class, who do not have an understanding of the struggles that other people face and prioritize the environment over the real world problems that lots of people are facing today. We think that thirdly, you're likely to make these groups more radically opposed environmentalists. The more that you antagonize them, the more that you say that we will not work with them. That's to say that they have no incentive to concede or to engage with you at all, at the point which you say the only way to come to the table is to concede that corporations are evil, corporations are against the environment, corporations stand in opposition to us as environmentalists. They have no incentive to come to the table, but moreover, they don't need to come to the table because of all those reasons I've just told you, but also because they are likely to weaponize that narrative that the environmentalists on the negative side are pushing out, which is that we hate corporations, we think that they are really evil, we think that they are really bad. So why do we get changes? Note that the majority of societies, whether you're in developing countries or in developed countries, rejects the notion that we should prioritize the environment above all else. That's to say that even to the extent that some people do believe in the environment and believe in environmentally friendly policies, they will not preference it over economic policies, and they will not preference it over many other issues that come to the forefront of politics. That's important because it shapes how we get buy-in on our side of the house. So firstly, we get buy-in because we're able to get the sort of push and change that we need to get more than just like development from and support from the left of the political spectrum. That's because we need more than just the left in order to get that support. You need to engage with some conservative individuals, and we think that you get that because you don't get that on the opposition side of the house, because corporations are a huge group that are ingrained within the capitalist structure and capitalist norms, and which have a huge amount of support because people in countries rely on those corporations. To get that buy-in, we need to start by not opposing those corporations diametrically, but by opposing certain practices and suggesting certain practice changes that would be able to work within that structure. That's to say that people associate the environment with privilege, and that changes under our side of the house because, one, it's not either you are a corporation pro-person and pro-employment and pro the economy, or you're pro the environment. It is no longer a trade-off where you must stand on one side of this debate. It is a world in which you are able to see that there is a compromise that can occur, and that we can get that change without having to go diametrically against like capitalist norms or the sorts of norms you've already subscribed to. That's also to say that you're less likely to see environmentalists as elites who will not compromise and who will not engage with the majority of the population. We see that also you get corporate buy-in because you're like in the status quo, there is some incentive to engage with like environmentally friendly practices, right? But to say like we think that the ones who we currently don't have on side, or the ones who might be in the middle and aren't as engaged in that, we are more likely to capture and we are more likely to engage them. But note that corporations who currently have incentives to be environmentally friendly can lose those incentives on the negative side when other corporations engage antagonistically because you piss them off as environmentalists. So what do we get? We get a world in which we are not adversarial towards these corporations, which means we're able to minimize the worst harms such as dumping, polluting. We're able to get those small changes which they have no incentive to change if we don't cozy up to them somewhat, or are incentivized to actually do. You're incentivized to engage in those practices when environmentalists are pushing you off. But also we get more accountability. That's to say that we can have greenhouse emission reports coming out. We also can have consultants who restructure the profit models so that they can show these companies, hey, if you restructured in X way, we're able to get maybe a higher initial investment, but in the long term, it would pay off as a huger profit margin because in the long term, that environmentally friendly procedure would actually get you benefits and it's more sustainable. That means that when you are not antagonistic, you are able to not have them digging their heels in. You are able to get them to move more with those social movements. We think that to the degree you can work closely with them, we can also capture competition. And that's because we can give the competitive advantage to certain companies, and we can call out other companies because we've engaged with the structure. We're not opposing all corporations anymore. We're able to show which corporations are better, give them competitive advantages, support them in terms of consumerism, and that's much better. We think that being anti-capitalistic is the worst way to engage with these corporations. We got environmental change for environmentalists, so proud to propose.
I thank the first affirmative for their speech, and I invite first negative to open the negative side of the debate.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Epic. All right, starting in 3. All right, suppose side affirmative is right. Suppose Glencore, has the media and the government in its pocket. They just love polluting. They just love shredding the Congolese rainforest and just dumping toxic mine tailings into rivers around there. So what exactly are they going to do with the environmentalists? Are they going to just hire them and be like, please tell us how to do things nicer? It's pretty obvious how they do things nicer. They just stop shredding the rainforest and dumping mine tailings in rivers. It seems that they would probably only hire environmentalists to just greenwash their operations, because you're going to get the environmentalists, they come into the board meeting or whatever, and they say, well, show us your plans or something. And the environmentalist says like, oh, well, the problem is you're doing your business model, which is digging up the rainforest. What's going to happen? They're not going to be like, oh, yes, let's just neglect all of our duties to the shareholders or whatever. Like, if it is the case that these companies are such fucking shit cunts, in that case, surely they're not going to listen to internal environmentalists. And if they do hire environmentalists, it's probably going to be quite cynical. Let's move on to setup. What are the interests of environmentalists? They want to help the environment, but also they have a significant amount of personal well-being. They significantly value their own, personal well-being. They're not going to compromise on their principles or whatever. What do we support on our side? We support criticizing companies from outside, mobilizing things like consumer activism, etc., but also lobbying the government to regulate through things like building popular support, etc. Exactly what it is that environmentalists are good at doing. 2 areas in this speech. First of all, how this contradicts your principles. Second of all, how this just ruins any sort of attempt at saving the environment. On the first, contradicting principles. Who are you? You're probably idealistic and you're probably well experienced. You've probably seen environmental tragedies and sort of felt the heartbreak when you watch the news and you see horrible things happening as a result of climate change or, Union Carbide's plant fucking up and killing 4,000 innocent people and then never paying reparations or being held liable in a court of law. And so it's like you see this as a huge part of your life. But then compare this to those sort of for whom you work. Some of these companies hiring environmentalists or whatever are probably reasonably altruistic, but they're probably going to do things anyway, regardless of if these people are on the inside or the outside of the company, simply because they've already declared their altruistic intent. But we think what's more likely is the companies that are greenwashing. For instance, companies like British Petroleum, who after, fucking up everything in the Gulf of Mexico, decided to hire heaps of environmentalists to try and greenwash their image. And this is probably the majority, simply because those who are already good on environmental issues simply don't need that many environmentalists there. And also given their characterization of an evil, captured government and media, they're probably not going to listen to environments. They're probably going to cynically hire them and whatever. So you're usually working for a bad one, but even if you're working for one of the good ones, you still probably oppose them on simple grounds because one, oh God, I can't read this, but basically in short, these are companies that still maximize their profits. They're still those that encourage consumerism. They're still those whose business models, at least in some part, contribute to environmental damage. Because even if they're like a really conscious airline or something, you still have to burn a huge amount of jet fuel to get there. So what are the impacts of this? You just absolutely feel abysmal. And it's like your entire identity you're working against, you're selling yourself out. You're probably on a pretty nice paycheck, but when you look at the news and see Kiribati going underwater, when you see cyclones happening that wouldn't have happened without climate change, you look around at the house in which you are, at the clothes which you bought, and you realize that it was all bought with blood money. And it's like, they can say oh, well, you're willing to sacrifice this for your ends. But consider for instance, I might oppose the genocide in Darfur, but if I was offered a contract by the Janjaweed to tidy up their operations, I still would not take it, even though maybe it would be on net good for saving lives or something, simply because it is so humiliating. It is so abysmal. You notice that everywhere you are going, you wear the symbol of death upon you, and you feel like you are enabling this. You feel like you've sold out. You are complicit in the very worst crimes against humanity. That's why we're already ahead, because you sacrifice your very humanity as environmentalists. So why is this bad for the movement? So let's just analyze the way in which this harms the movement. One, you get a huge amount of infighting. That is because many environmentalists are opposed to all sorts of organizations, and often they tend to have very absolutist views. That is because they are diametrically opposed to a lot of the things that corporations do, but many of them have a very bad experience with corporations in the past, and often environmentalists are environmentalists because of that really bad experience. They see corporations saying one thing and doing the other, which means that as a result of this, although some environmentalists might be working for these companies and whatever, the vast majority of them might oppose it, and you could end up with with the movement being torn into. Second of all, you look like idiots and hypocrites because you are working for the bad guys. You're the guy who's being contracted for Anadarko while they're just like fracking the shit out of any single state in the American West. And so you're working for the bad guys, which makes mudslinging against you easier. When you try and lobby for things like a carbon tax or whatever, conservatives say, well, look at who's in the pocket of big coal or whatever. You know, they're just happy to throw those sorts of things at you. But also it tarnishes you because if you work for British Petroleum or something, you are seen as being a hypocrite. You are seen as not being genuine, etc. So when they say you look like dumb, rich, white, hyper-principled people, you're the ones who are taking blood money directly from the coffers of the genocide heirs. Third of all, if you feel like shit, as you do, for selling out and working with the most inhuman people you can ever meet on Earth, you are probably simply going to stop being environmentalists. You're probably going to leave. And so at the end of this way, the way it harms the movement, it bypasses almost all of affirmative. And I do not even need to do rebuttal at this point, simply because the movement itself dissolves and is unable to accomplish anything good. Moving on to why this won't even work. So who works with you? Again, it is maybe a tiny fraction of altruistic companies who are going to be altruistic either way, or it is more likely the more cynical ones that are trying to greenwash their image. But even then, there are still incredible limits on what you can do, even in the most altruistic companies. That is, one, companies often have already done a bit to change, you know, and they already have a few incentives to, for instance, avoid government regulations, avoid consumer activism, and simply because sustainability in a few places is profitable, so they're probably reluctant to do extra things or whatever. Second of all, there is simply a huge amount that is outside your control. For instance, the shareholders might vote down anything that you recommend them to do, or it's simply the business model. For instance, if you are hired by Royal Dutch Shell and they're asking, how can we tidy up our operations? You can't just say, oh, please stop digging up oil. You know, like the oil is going to happen anyway. And also it's like, if they do listen to you a bit too much, they're just going to get sued by the shareholders, right? Because they have a legal liability to maximize profits for them. Third of all, you simply have a limited say because you're seen as being an outside environmentalist. You simply hired there to quiet it down, a few sort of like angry government people and whatever. And so you simply get shut down by the board. If you're the one who says in an Anadarko board meeting, we need to change the way in which we frack or something, they're just going to laugh at you and leave the room. You know, like there's nothing you can really do because you're seen as being an outsider. You're not particularly great. Harms of this are twofold. One, you simply cannot criticize companies as easily. That is, one, you are financially implicated because, you know, your movement is the one that's getting funded by these corporations. Second of all, you have personal connections. That's because if you're working with someone, you probably have a close bond with them and you're far less likely to try and criticize them as a result of that. Third of all, you likely don't want to acknowledge your own failure, the fact that you were working for a company and they still ended up fucking everything up. The second harm of this is it demobilizes government regulation because corporations are seen to be taking control. And so people think there's no need to work for the government because the corporations are issuing all these nice green colored press releases. And so the government is less likely to regulate things. And this demobilizes the largely dissatisfied number of youth throughout. So to the extent the affirmative talks about compromise, we don't need compromise. There's no compromise to be reached because government regulation bypasses that. So last of all, under this issue of effectiveness, let's talk about the counterfactual. Note the huge opportunity cost of this under side affirmative because it requires a huge amount of time and effort to gain inroads into these particular corporations, and a huge amount of time and resources are tied up there. But you can't spend as much time on things like getting mass support, lobbying for government support, or getting better. Oh yeah, sorry. And they say, well, there's all these problems. Corporate capture, they somehow control the media, even though the media's always talking about how climate change is really bad. Like, look, there is a huge amount of people who are willing to vote on issues about climate change, and we're getting more and more regulation as we go on in history. So like the last decade was all right. The decade before that was abysmal. And it looks like the coming decade is going to be way better simply because people care more and more about climate change and issues like that as their effects are becoming more and more felt. But government regulations are likely to come into existence because voters are lobbying for them. Voters mobilized by these activists. But one, these things actually affect all corporations, not just the corporations that hire environmentalists. You can actually deal with fracking rather than doing green fracking, whatever that is, and it avoids problems of competition. Second of all, it won't simply get undone when they need a profit. A company that does greenwash, like does something green, as soon as they get like their profits threatened, they're simply going to stop doing your environmental regulations. If corporations are evil, they're not going to listen to internal environmentalists. The government is the answer. The government works. It's viable. That's why we oppose.
I thank the first negative for their speech. I invite second affirmative to continue the affirmative side of the debate.
Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Can you move? You should not stand there because recording has to do my thing. Okay. I will start in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, when the opposition side said that environmentalists look at the TV and see people dying and they feel bad because it hurts their very soul, ask yourself, if you stand in opposition to no end, whether or not you are more likely to be complicit when people die around you, you could have fixed it, but you stood beside because you thought you could fight the large evils of corporations. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First, I want to talk about how our model works because they clearly don't listen to our speaker. Second, I'll talk about the principle and why it was ridiculous. Third, I'll talk about internal change in fighting and like the messaging that exists. First, how does our model work? Obviously, we think we are better able to capture companies that have an incentive to be somewhat environmental friendly, but we think we're able to push them further than the tokenistic changes that they speak about, which is to say that we get more consultants within these corporations. It is able for us to do things like leverage off the narratives. For example, if you opt into more environmentally friendly practices, it actually benefits your company in the long run. Actually, we don't think capitalism is so evil. Maybe you just don't stop dumping waste in the developing world and Nigerian Delta. We dump in a different part of the world that is maybe less harm as a result of this, which means to say it is not just altruistic companies that are like a definite win for their side. We think we can still push altruistic companies. But the second is, what about evil companies? Because their argument was just, oh, companies are never going to listen to you, so it doesn't matter in your world. You just have tokenistic changes like greenwashing. Couple of reasons for why this is untrue. First thing we would say is, obviously our model allows things like shareholder activism. Combank of Australia had a majority amount of shareholders that were able to do things like pass special resolutions that force, for example, the directors to do reporting on carbon emission. These are things that are able to be done by IPO. We collectivize our money, do things like purchase shares. You don't even require 50%. You require 5% to do things like bring up operation remedies and injunctions to the status quo. Third, obviously, because the reason why we're able to enter into evil companies is because of the way we're messaging, right? The reason why companies wouldn't want to hire environmentalists is because the messaging is corporations are evil, corporate capture and any form of businesses are evil. Once our messaging is, for example, that you can profit from this in the long run. In fact, this is a more sustainable method because you get tax breaks from being environmentally friendly. They are likely to hire, which means we are likely to able to enter altruistic companies, which we think they are a greater benefit we can arrive. But second, we are the only team that gets to enter into evil companies that would have no incentive on the opposition world to listen to these individuals. Second, in terms of principles, oh my God, this is the whitest thing I've heard in my life. Let us stand by in principle because we support individuals on one side. That means we are akin to supporting the Janjaweed in Sudan. If you are part of an opposition in a rebel group in like a conflict zone, and that rebel group was going to get massacred, and you stood on the lines when you could have been a part of the Janjaweed and massacred 2 or 3 less people, you are obviously guilty by omission because you could have done something, and that makes you more complicit, right? Because their argument is we shouldn't be complicit in this because your whole life has been things like minimizing harm. That is contingent on you proving that being opposition to corporations by and large minimizes more harm. If it's true that we can minimize harm by being involved in that, we think that doesn't mean you have to oppose them inherently. We think obviously that means we can work within them. Second, this is principally consistent, right? Most environmentalists, this motion is as environmentalists, are not the liberal left, super small amount of like hippie vegans in this debate. A vast majority of environmentalists are people in the developing world who work in things like the Nigerian Delta in Malaysia. Those are people who are most viscerally impacted by things like climate change. These people are not opposed to things like social mobility or things like welfare and income. They are opposed to the way capitalism has been co-opted to be anti-environmentalist. We say, in fact, most likely to be true, that it's principally consistent to work within this because we're not opposed to welfare per se. We are opposed to the way corporate capture and economic welfare has been used in diametric opposition to principles. But most importantly, if they significantly increase the harm, this principle obviously makes no sense. How do we increase the benefit in this debate? Because their argument was threefold. First, they will criticize companies externally. No response at all from Ellen that gives you many reasons for why people don't vote on environmental policies. Their assertion here was people are in the status quo are more environmentally conscious. That is Australia, and that is maybe Victoria, one state, right? A vast majority of the developing world doesn't believe in things like environmental protection. Because of the current economic recession and things like coronavirus, things like, for example, my small family businesses, things like people hyperbolically discount the harm in the future for the environment, and they know they are currently suffering, their kids are really poor, people are impacted by poverty, things like governments that are nationalists, like the BJP, for example, or like Awami League, or like Barisan National, that co-opt things like environmental protection and environmentalism for things like national identity. Proton, Petronas, look at Tata, look at Vashundra, all are examples of companies that are tied to national identities because they are state-owned enterprises. Ask yourself, who are these people who are going to criticize companies and vote in favor of their policies? It is 1 or 2% in most developed countries. It is nobody in developing countries. Second mechanism they give you is we will do government lobbying. But how? How are you going to beat corporate funding, right? Corporate funding is the one that is currently being monopolized. Their incentives are aligned with things like media companies. In fact, most media companies, apparel companies that have subsidiaries that are industrial, like for example, Tata in India owns a large conglomerate for media houses and narratives, but they also hold industrial hubs, for example, which is why is government going to take money from you, right? It makes no sense, obviously, because governments will take money from large corporations, which means they have given you no no mechanism in this debate for how they get changed. The last mechanism they give you is the media. The media is really pro the environment. Jesus Christ, guys, obviously we exist in a liberal bubble, but a vast majority of the population access media that is quite moderate. For example, it's very easy to say things like job loss is harming your population. Obviously, it's easy to say things like, for example, there's famine in most countries. People in the society are not bought in by this model. That is why your mechanisms don't work. The second thing they say is we will be seen as hypocrites. Ask yourself, who will see us as hypocrites? I agree. The hippie, white, left will think we're hypocrites. A vast majority of the developing world will finally see us as reasonable for the reasons that we are finally understanding that there are some benefits to corporate and like involvement inside, like for example, capitalism, for example. In fact, the status quo is most people think we're hypocrites. People like Greta Thunberg get so much shit because everyone asks, it's very easy for you, white woman who lives in Sweden, you have income, you have an UBI. Of course, you are environmentally friendly. I have to work 3 jobs a day. I rely on corporations. Corporations are the ones that do things like schooling in my country. It is status quo where you are seen as a hypocrite. Second thing they say is there's going to be infighting. All right. First and foremost, for the reasons I gave you earlier, the vast majority of environmentalists are from developing countries and communities. In fact, the status quo means we have less infighting than the status quo. The second thing you must ask yourself is who splinters movements more strongly? In their world, you would splinter people because you would ask people, you have to choose between one or the other. Either you are you're pro-environment or you are pro-businesses. And if you ask people to make this question, everybody or a vast majority of people are going to be pro-businesses because we live in a capitalist world where people don't know how to restructure environment because of the vast smear campaigns and misinformation. Things like, for example, the inability to understand what on earth does the world look like with no corporations. If you ask people to be diametrically opposed to corporations, people are unlikely to support your side. Speaker, this means they have more infighting, they have greater hypocrisy, they have not given you a method to getting any political change with regards to consumer altruism, with regards to government lobbying, with regards to people voting in the elections, with regards to media. They have absolutely lost this debate. Now, just to seal the deal, in most countries, obviously we think there's a huge co-option of economic models by strong state structure. That is, for example, hedge funds in Saudi Arabia that fund things like Vision Fair. That is in like China, for example, or places like India. If you don't opt into that system is going to crush you. Yeah, and we think on a comparison. Like, I'm going to be realistic. It is not like we are going to get huge changes. Yeah, we're not going to restructure the whole world. But ask yourself, who is more likely to create incremental changes? It is a side in which there is at least some incentives for companies to listen to you. You are likely to exist on that board and co-opt things like an economic narrative. Remember, when you stop making companies decide, it is either being environmentally friendly or protecting your bottom line. When you co-opt that too, that gives the incentive for companies to be better. Speaker, it is not true in this debate that any team can claim broad changes in this debate. The worst case scenario is we get greenwashing. That is their best case scenario because you good luck getting companies to listen to you. In that best case, we think you've lost this debate. So for all those reasons, we have won.
I thank second affirmative for their speech, and I invite second negative to continue the negative side of the debate.
I think the affirmative team loses this debate in the opening minutes of their speech because they say things like corporations hate environmental activists. They see them to be entirely antithetical to their interests, and there is a long history of animosity between these two groups of people. And those facts are the exact reason that at the point you as a corporation choose to hire an environmentalist to work in your corporate infrastructure, you are very unlikely to meaningfully listen to the things that that person has to say. You are very likely to use them tokenistically. You are likely to afford them little actual power in the decision-making process, and are just likely to point to them and say things like, we did good, we hired an environmental activist. That has to be compared against the benefits that we bring you at side negative. And no, that doesn't mean that as an environmentalist, you have to take a staunchly anti-corporation position, right? Because presumably we care about the environment and we care about getting change. And that's why you can take a moderate position, saying things like, yes, we accept that in certain circumstances, environmental costs have to be weighed up against the economic benefits to a community. It's why you can engage with communities in a reasonable manner and say things like, we accept and understand your concerns, but we think there are ways to balance the economic concerns that you have with the environmental concerns that we have. And we say that gets better outcomes in the long run, but also doesn't mean you sell your soul in a way that makes you feel truly terrible about yourself. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. The first one is, what change do you actually get in organisations under the affirmative teams model? And then the second one is about the principle. And I note that the affirmative team wants to make this principle contingent. We don't think it is, right? We think independently it exists as a benefit or harm in this debate. But importantly, that if the principle is contingent, then that means that at the second we prove you don't get change in these organisations, they necessarily lose the entire debate. So 2 questions onto the first one. What change do you get in these organisations? We tell you a number of things in Mark's speech about why it is that companies already have a lot of incentives to care about the environment and implement good environmental policy where it is possible for them to do so. That's first, that in some countries there is great degrees of government regulation that force them to do so. The second is that there is often public pressure that resists against form of environmental damage. So when they say things like, we're going to get them to stop waste dumping and doing things like oil spills, public pressure already exists against those things, which is the reason why companies choose to mitigate. The final thing to note, though, is that often it's incredibly cost efficient for them to do so. So when they say things like an environmentalist can go and advise them on cost efficient ways and prove to them that it's more economically efficient to adopt green technologies, they are businesses, they are run for profit, they already know these things and in fact have profit incentives to do those things irrespective of whether you have Greta Thunberg integrated into your organization or not. And what that means in this debate is either companies are already adopting these things to the extent that they possibly can, or they aren't for a reason. The reason being they damage the environment, they don't care about it, and they're not going to listen at the point you thrust an environmental activist into their sphere. And that's important in this debate because it's the comparative they don't engage with. The response that we get to all of this material is just to be like, oh, well, you might do more of it. So like you hire more people into your corporation. Again, I don't think that proves structurally why you get any of these benefits that they claim you do. Literally the only response that we get to all of this material in Amrit's speech is to be like, but we prove that you get actual change because shareholder activism. The first thing to note is this debate is not about shareholder activism. Environmentalists working with corporations is not the same as environmentalists just buying shares in corporations. Yeah. We can do that too. But secondly, that's a particularly harmful form, right? Because you are literally increasing the equity and capital of the company that is destroying the fucking environment in the hope that maybe you can get a shareholder remedy of changing the outcome of a vote somewhere down the line. We say that's a fundamentally terrible form of activism. But importantly, we also tell you a whole host of reasons why in the best case, where you're integrating extra consultants into your company, you're unlikely to get meaningful change, all of which go to no response. The first is that a lot of the changes they want to make require literal restructuring of that organization, which is something they set up in their model. And the interesting thing about organizational restructuring is that usually it requires approval from a whole host of actors, which is insufficient to say that a consultant can action that individually. Secondly, often you require extra approval for the types of things you want to do. So that's to say that even if you can come to the table with an idea, you have to have a board of directors agree to it or shareholders vote on it. And given that they have fiduciary obligations to the corporation and profit at the end of the day, those people are unlikely to change their minds, even if it is the case you present an idea on the table to them. The final thing to note, though, is that even if all of that is not true, and hypothetically you can pose an idea and the corporation is likely to just like implement it and there's no structural barriers in that organization that prevent that from happening, you're likely to have limited say for the reason they tell you, which is that these people fundamentally oppose you. They see you as antithetical to their interests and they have no interest in engaging with you whatsoever. The only mechanism they give you here is that you're being seen to compromise at the point you come to the table. But the problem is that's completely underwritten at the point in time when you're presenting radical counter proposals about the way they should shift their business. There's no compromise there. You're just employed for them doing the same thing that you were otherwise. And importantly, they feel empowered because they know that generally you've been silenced in your ability to encapsulate change. Final thing that they want to say here is just to be like, but you guys don't get any benefits too because it's really hard to get change on your side of the house. I think the first thing to note is that, as I already told in my introduction, we don't have to take a kill-all corporations approach to change. And that means you can do reasonable things like advocate to the average person about why it is that you think economic and environmental interests can be reconciled. And would say, as environmentalists that care about reducing environmental damage, that's the approach you are likely to adopt in a whole host of cases. But the second thing to note is that we say you actually are more likely to get change on our side of the house for a few reasons. The first, you maximize your chances of getting change when you collectivize. By the affirmative team's own characterization, these are incredibly powerful organizations that often have media influence and the control of the government. And that means that when you enter into them, you have very little say over the structure of how it operates or ability to change their policy at all. Secondly, we're talking about a very large number of people here, right? Because environmental activists are great. So when you say something like, well, 15,000 environmental activists could enter into 15,000 individual companies with one in each, or you could collectivize together and push for change, we think you're more likely to get government regulation on our side. The third thing to note is that historically this has been successful, right? In September 2019, we saw the biggest environmental protests we have ever seen. So it's not sufficient for AMREC to be flippant about Mark's analysis about there being organic change. That organic change is an important contextual factor in this debate, which you guys ignore. The final thing to note, though, is that you are more likely to achieve change when you are a united group, because we tell you reasons why you fracture the movement, which means that in the future, other environmentalists can't campaign for change, even if you are not employed by a corporation. The only response that we get here from AMREC is to be like, you're already splintered. Obviously, we're talking about different groups of people here. She is talking about splintering between people who are not environmentalists and those who are. We're talking about splintering in the most dedicated, hardcore activist group of people who are constantly lobbying for change and therefore most likely to be successful at it. I think the final thing to note here, though, is that the end game obviously doesn't have to be regulation, right? It can be things like mobilizing activists to inform the public and educate them, to undo the messaging that corporations espouse, which is that economics and the environment are at odds with one another and need to pick one. And that may not lead to immediate short-term results, but in the long term, it undoes the damage which they solidify, because you remove your ability to counter that narrative at the point you join those corporations. It entirely legitimizes it. And that means it's impossible to then revert to a narrative that says, maybe these two things aren't as irreconcilable as you think they are. You need to get change in the long term. We think our principle in this debate stands. It fucking sucks if you're a person that feels complicit in change, even if you think that you could get some change on their side of the house. They don't respond properly to a lot of our principal material and benefits. We oppose.
I thank second negative for their speech, and I invite third affirmative to conclude the affirmative side, substantive affirmative part of the debate.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. If in first speaker you say that you don't want to be Janjaweed, but in second speaker you say that, oh, but we can also believe in the Janjaweed. We can moderate our policies in that way. We can believe in both corporatism and that. But we can also buy shares in the Janjaweed. I don't think, firstly, you have a principle. Secondly, at worst, you're incredibly contradictory in the way in which you're approaching this debate. Thirdly, I'm not sure if, like buying shares, etc., if you concede that it is actually a good way to do so, given that you have limited political capital, is actually a way of working with the corporations within the corporations, which means by that and that only, they would have lost the debate in general. But I'm going to be very generous, and I'm going to take down bit by bit as to how you create change under your side and our side, and compare them quite holistically. Because you need to engage to the nuance of the debate, right? Because recognize that you, as the environmentalists, have limited political capital, limited economic power, and ability to, have educated individuals on board to do certain things, so on and so forth. You can either spend all of this energy criticizing corporations and trying to get change, trying to move voters to change, which we have given tons of reasons why it's impossible, or you can try to change corporate structures. Here's the nuance that is so important for the debate. On comparison, are corporate structures at least somewhat malleable to the extent to which you can get actionable change? corporate structures involve the fact that you can get board of directors in, the fact that you can get shareholder activism under our side if you can buy some form of shares within corporations. The fact that corporate structures in general means that there is a democratization of the way in which corporates think because of the way in which it's structured, given the fact that even in case of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg does not own majority shares. Majority shares are actually owned by the public, which gives you an avenue to enact changes within corporations, certain things that you won't do under their side at all. The reason this nuance is so very important is compare the balance of probability, right? Your ability to change these internal structures, spending all of your energy, versus your ability to change societal norms, especially in developing countries where they absolutely don't believe that environmentalism is something that's important, recycling is something that's important, and so on and so forth. You need to weigh these two and see in which you can get things. Okay, let's move into the more the more details of their case. They say that you are because the corporations are reluctant to change things, you cannot change things overall. Here's the thing, right? First of all, we can indeed have some form of ability to pressurize this corporation, not just pressurize, make them do things in terms of shareholder activism when we are operating in our best capacity. We say that if we have the capacity to do so, obviously this depends on the amount of capacity that we have, but if we have the capacity to do so, we can actually force corporations to do certain things. Secondly, they say that, oh, you cannot criticize them. But I don't see why that's that's exclusive under their side, right? Because if you are, say, imagine you are Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and you are a Democrat, right? You can still criticize the Democrat Party in it that there are certain ideals that you believe in, which means if you're a part of a corporation, especially in a way in which they say that, oh, they're not attached to the corporation fully, then you can criticize these corporations if they don't listen to you, if they don't buy into what you're saying. We think that is quite possible under our side. Secondly, they say, oh, you're going to be sued by shareholders. They're going to laugh at you. They're going to go through the boardroom. Here's the thing, right? If there are indeed corporations that are diametrically opposed to you and you cannot make any headway into them, if you're indeed not working close to a particular corporation, then what incentive do we have of pandering to them? But rather, we do still have the ability to criticize them. To the extent we say Enron accepts you and Enron accepts certain forms of your demands and you're working closely with Enron, you can still criticize BP in the same world because you can only, like, this is the same as working with governments. Right? If the government does not listen to you, you can still criticize the government and go for that. We think that can still happen. But secondly, with regards to like sued by shareholders, not like being laughed at them, etc., if you have a seat at the table, right? Oftentimes when it comes to board of directors, they assume, and this is a very fundamental assumption in their case, is that corporations have all the information in the world to make decisions on the basis of what environmentalism is all about. Because they say, oh, but they're going to naturally do this. But this is not true, right? Oftentimes, in which if you've ever been or worked in a corporation, you know that a lot of corporate decisions are taken in the board of directors to which what they feel passionately about at that moment. Having a voice at that table is much more important than having a voice at a talk show back home, which you don't know if these people are going to watch. To the extent to which you can make them persuade them to your argument and make like change their voices, so on and so forth. Which means having a voice at the table is incredibly important, and having the ability to render them your credibility is important. Then they say we're going to mobilize like consumer activism. Here's the thing, right? To the extent to which consumer activism is something that is indeed a capital under your side, in which world do you use it better? In a world in which you are a part of a corporation, where you can change that corporation and work in favor of that consumer activism, or in a world where you're diametrically opposed to it and you constantly use consumer activism against these corporations. The reason this is important is if you indeed want to make corporations believe that these consumers, this small group of consumers who are consumer activists are going to buy their product, you can only do this when you're inside the corporations and actually make them care about these consumer activists. Because consumer activists aren't very big under these spaces. To the extent to which we saw changes within manufacturing companies about labor standards when it came from within these like manufacturing companies, which care about labor standards specifically in developing countries and so on and so forth. In conclusion, all of this means that being a part of the corporate structure is incredibly important because there are ways in which corporate structures operate systematically, which gives you the room to change. Under their side, they have no mechanism for change whatsoever. The only mechanism that they have is we're going to lobby voter power. Guys, the context of the world is a world in which right-wing populism is at an all-time high. Trump, Boris Johnson, Modi are not really known as corporatists, and they have the vast majority of political capital all across the world. Neither does Xi Jinping, by the way. You need to name one country in which you can make this work. Finland, Denmark have it. under our word, we make more meaningful changes in places that matter because they don't count for carbon emissions at all. Even America in general is like quite bad in that regard, that you need to lobby and change corporate structures in a way in which you can make meaningful changes within this thing. Lastly, with regards to developing countries, and this is something that they have absolutely lost, right? To the analysis that developing countries are often very, like there is a huge inertia in these places to change. And they have no mechanism so far. First to speak, I think Seamus is too late with this regard, is that how do you really bring change within places that are so economically hard stricken in general? To the extent to which you want to bring a change within the Nigerian Delta, the Brazilian Amazon forest, or the Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh, you need to make sure that corporations abide by certain rules and regulations, to the extent to which you can only do so if you are internally integrated within their structures. Because oftentimes in these cases, corporations do not have a huge trade-off of profit and like environmentalism in these places. Only even small tweaks can change a lot within Nigerian Delta. In these places, the point at which, worst case scenario, it is tokenistic, right? It is tokenistic that we want to greenwash our company and so on and so forth. At least greenwashing still means that you need some credibility to do so. For you to earn that credibility, you have to listen to the environmentalists in your company. If you do not listen to the environmentalists in your company, everyone's going to know that you're not listening to the environmentalists of your company. So you as a company don't get the benefit of greenwashing. Under their side, if environmentalists keep screaming at them, they can just discount them altogether and keep their bare minimum tokenistic change under themselves, as opposed to actually having meaningful tokenistic change overall. This debate is about a scale. We do not overhaul the system. Elon Musk isn't becoming president tomorrow, but under our world, we get incremental changes that are so vastly meaningful, especially for people living in the deltas of developing countries. Incredibly proud to propose.
I thank third affirmative for their speech, and I invite third negative to conclude the substantive part of the debate.
There is this black hole at the center of that team's case. Because they say, oh, we're going to push further for reform. How? Why? Why will they listen to you? And they undercut it at the same time by saying stuff, well, there's no sufficient will. People don't even care about ethical consumerism and stuff like that. Right. Well, if there's no baseline of ethical consumerism and environmentalist energy, then why do the companies even care from a PR perspective about this anyway? 5 questions. First on the principle, second on how this affects the environmentalist movement, 2 separate issues about efficacy, and finally on why our position is bad. I'm going to move quickly. First on principle. This one is actually very simple because they never properly respond to it. We tell you a few things. First, we establish what your interests are likely to have been like if you join the environmentalist movement, meaning you've probably had a lot of sufficiently bad experiences with these sorts of corporate enterprises. And we also point out that their values are often absolutist. That's why you chain yourself to a tree rather than actually going off to join a management consultancy in order to get money, in order to be an effective altruist in this area. There is no response to that. The responses that we do get, notably, don't engage with our actual claim here. Because Amrit says, like, how do you improve it? It's guilty by omission. That's not the point. The point is you feel terrible about yourself because you accept blood money. You didn't respond to the practical impacting of the principal argument. And that means we're already ending this debate because every night you go to sleep, you feel fucking terrible about yourself. Second question with respect to harming the environmentalist movement. My observation here is this team actually never contests this. Amrit's only claim at second, reiterated by Trudeau at third, is to say, well, they're just like a certain part of the movement. 2 impacts we give you. First, increased infighting. Second, it tarnishes your image. No response to either of them, but what do we hear? The thing we hear is that most environmentalists are from the developing world. First, this is a concession that you do disenfranchise white hippies. And maybe Amrit doesn't care about that, but those are the people that have the most money. They're the people that have the most power. They're the people who fought to tear Urawara in New Zealand. They're the people who push in America and push Joe Biden to introduce a $2 trillion fund for the environment. Those people matter. They weren't important. The second thing to say is those people in the developing world, and I'm going to just like step out of the debate here for a second. I think reasonably probably do care, because when the Karaya people of Brazil have their home bulldozed by fucking Equa Corriente, a Chinese company that came in, of course you give a shit. Of course it's a personal, visceral thing for you that means you are not okay with that. The final thing to say here is sure it was like it's too late to give a reason here, but no, Katie gave you a second reason here, which is that you have an incentive to reach out as environmentalists, which was already in the debate, which is unresponded to. This is important because it means that all the organic change that we have in all environmentalism gets weaker because people attack you, you get fractures within your own movement, you can do less. Not an adequate response. Next question, what do we stand for? Is it good? My first observation here is if consumers do not care, which seems to be some of their claims, then why would they listen to you? But we established that there is an opportunity cost. That opportunity cost can be spent on things like protests and lobbying and government regulation. And that is better because it affects all companies. What do they say? The first claim they make is with respect to corporate capture. First, if this is true, then you have to dismantle it eventually because many companies, as they acknowledge it, third affirmative, finally cannot or will not change like Rio Tinto. Second, this has been overcome. Look at Costa Rica, look at Cuba, look at Bolivia, look at Biden's $2 trillion plan. Those things were fixed with active campaigning that overcame the corporate incentives of corporate America. Like, you guys need to engage in the real world. Third, there are some reforms that don't piss off those sorts of companies, like sustainable energy funds, which you don't care about because there's an allocation of money towards other people and which we can get on our side. The second thing they say is with respect to media capture. This is the only other real claim here. First, there is an enormous number of progressive media outlets like Guardian and NBC. Second, increasingly, the environmentalist movement has become mainstream and powerful. Look at the global climate strike in September of last year, which was the second largest strike or human action of all time. There were 4,500 separate strikes happening at the same time. Second, it overlaps with other mainstream progressive movements like Black Lives Matter, and that means it's unpopular to oppose and they aren't going to smear or attack you for those reasons. The next issue I want to deal with is why what they are describing won't work. The first thing we establish is that a lot of companies will not work with you, which they finally at third affirmative just say, yeah, sure, we're not going to get Rio Tinto. Right. But they are the corporate capture you're talking about. They are the most pernicious things, which means you've necessarily limited your benefit to an tiny, tiny amount, and companies that will probably already had money allocated towards a CSR budget anyway. So what is your additional benefit? It's like 6 speeches in the debate, and it is still entirely unclear. The next thing to say is that their mechanism is just entirely unsubstantiated. They say things like you push further and shareholder activism, which I'll get to in a second, but why would they listen to you if it will anger their shareholders? They never answer the most basic aspect of profitability in these sorts of companies, which is why they're going to lose. The next thing they say is they listen to you about labor rights. But why? They already have advisors who can tell them those things. If it is a PR nightmare, they will know, they will factor that into their triple bottom line. If it is bad for the environment and that could get discovered and hurt their profitability, they will factor that in. It was never clear why environmentalists being there was particularly important, particularly when we tell you at first, other people like environmental scientists have more intelligence and more expertise in that area. The next claim they make is they get changed for 3 reasons. The first is you need more than the left. Firstly, this is an assertion and never properly proven. And second, we've made some pretty good progress. Look at Tahuara, look at Bolivia, look at the Ganges, which was just granted personhood 2 years ago. Second, they say you can only oppose certain practices. Right, that's bad for you guys. You can't oppose the worst practices. The third thing they say is that they can learn about competitive advantages. They can learn about them anyway. It's in their corporate interests and their fiduciary duty to their shareholders to learn about the avenues to get more profitability. So if renewable energy is better for them, they will learn it and they will use those things naturally. The last thing they say is about shareholder activism. We point out that this isn't actually the topic and you're not working with them. Third affirmative says, oh, well, that means you concede it's good. Well, firstly, it doesn't matter if we did, but secondly, we told you reasons why it was not. Because the opportunity cost is the enormous amount of money you'd have to invest in Rio Tinto and instead pushing that money towards lobbying governments, getting protests and rallies together, which we told you was successful. They then say, oh, the other thing to say is it's difficult because there are a huge number of other barriers, like poison pills in corporate constitutions, things like priority voting rights, which means you can never get someone on the board when you're buying those things secondhand. Look, if George Soros could have fixed Rio Tinto by buying it, he would have. Finally, final question with respect to opposition and the other external harms here. No, they never actually respond properly to a lot of our material here. Firstly, they with respect to like why you are more likely to be criticized, the only thing we get is Shuradev, who says, well, you'd still get criticized as a Democrat, but your own, or you would still criticize people if you were a Democrat. First, by your own analysis, this becomes substantially less likely. You haven't engaged about a tangible 4 reasons why you would be less likely to criticize. You just said, here's an example. And secondly, by your own analysis, these companies smear you, which means you're less likely to do it because now you know that Rio Tinto will say, oh, this person's a dickhead, and then make you look terrible. So that meant that you were less likely to criticize them, which increased their power even more. What do they say? First, they say they're going to smear you. 4 responses. First, this constructs an incentive to never critique them. Second, they now smearing you puts a target on their back so they're unlikely to smear you. Third, there's a risk of backlash because of the mainstream notion of environmentalism these days. And fourth, they will get smeared by other environmentalists if they do it to you. The second thing they say is you're positioned as elite environmental and white intellectuals. First, this is untrue. Look at Bolsonaro bulldozing the indigenous land of the Amazon. Second, you literally work for corporations. You look a lot worse now. And third, the risk of a PR nightmare for misrepresenting you makes them reluctant to do this. The final thing they say is they are more opposed to working with you because you've been opposed to them. But that actually harms your case because you've been opposed to them for 70 years, which means that they're probably not going to give you a lot of leeway at the moment. So we gave you a plan to make things better. Things were getting better. This team actively curtailed that progress. I don't think I've ever been more proud to oppose.
I thank third negative for their speech, and I invite negative reply to conclude the negative side of the debate.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, starting in 3. 2 issues. Firstly, the effects on the environmentalists personally. Second of all, what changes the environment for the better. On the first, we said you feel complicit in massive crimes because you sold your soul and everything in your life is bought with blood money. For instance, even though I may oppose what the Junjaweed is doing, I would not join them even if that had the effect of moderating them. Maybe a little hyperbolic, but I was truly surprised when the response we heard at Second Affirmative was that you have an obligation to join the Junjaweed and do crimes against humanity. I would like to see that one tried at Nuremberg, but let's deal with the actual debate here, because it's not about obligations, it's about the way it affects you. So even if you do somewhat prioritize the way that, like, the health of the environment, there is still a huge priority you place on your own personal well-being and your moral integrity. Because at the end of the day, we are dealing with humans. We are dealing with particularly morally motivated humans, not dealing with consequentialist robots who are able to justify themselves carrying out the most obscene acts of violence. Remember, it is an actor debate, and it is about how environmentalists personally feel about their role in this. And this can easily outweigh the issue of environmentalist gains, right? Because many environmentalists are not willing to sacrifice everything in their lives, all of their principles, in order to get marginal improvements in the environment, and that's why we're already ahead. But there are 2 further harms to people feeling bad about this. First of all is the movement likely implodes simply because a certain number of people become really disenchanted with environmentalism and so leave, but also a number of environmentalists will not be happy with certain environmentalists working for this corporation. There'll be a large amount of infighting, and the whole movement will become far less efficient. We'll see as stupid. The second harm is that environmentalists are seen as joker-pilled idiots who sold out. So when Side Affirmative says, well, actually, they're seen as white idealists, no, they're still accomplishing meaningful change by lobbying the government, but also how does someone working for BHP not look like a hypocritical Burke when they're taking money from the people who are doing the worst things at the end of the day? If I joined the Junjaweed and said I'm doing this to moderate them, I don't think I will be seen as a principled and ethical individual who's standing up for what's right, you know? So let's move on who changes the environment for the better. Let's talk about Affirmative's plan. How do you change a corporation by working within them? Good companies that hire environmentalists are going to do good anyway, regardless if there's an environmentalist on the inside or not. They'll consult other people, fine, nothing changes there. But what about the bad ones? They will likely hire environmentalists cynically, and they're probably not going to listen to you. They have 3 responses. They say, 1, well, you need a green image to get profits. But the thing is, there's an emphasis on only the image rather than actually changing the practices at that company. And so it's probably going to be superficial, nothing lasts, it'll just be greenwash, and that comes at the expense of demobilizing government regulation. The second thing they say is, well, you have a voice at the table, but it's a voice that no one takes seriously, and so they're not going to listen. But also no one's going to listen to you if listening to you means that they risk shareholder lawsuits. The third and probably most ludicrous response they have is that you can buy shares. How expensive? How are you going to buy up stocks in all the main mining firms? If you have that much money, hundreds of billions of dollars, we are simply going to purchase the government and we will simply enact that ourselves. But also, yeah, like you don't need a math degree to realize that. And this the uselessness of this path comes with 2 costs. First of all, it's hard to criticize them. They say, well, you still can criticize them, but it's more difficult, you know, debates are marginal. And then second of all, it demobilizes government regulation because people think the problem's been worked on by these corporations when actually it's only the image rather than the substance that's being worked on. So we get change through other means on our side. This is the second half of the second issue. They say, well, you can't change government because it's captured by the corporations. And how come Joe Biden promised a $2 trillion climate change plan? How come there have been enormous climate marches? Because when they say, well, you need a green image in order to get profits, they concede that green causes are incredibly popular and thus are likely to be politically popular, right? And then they say, well, you can't change corporations regulations in the developing world, but also like on affirmative, they probably can't change them either, right? Because they need green courses to be reasonably popular for their mechanism to work. But yes, we can. We think people in the developing world do care about the environment, if their rivers are toxic and they're inhaling polluted air, but also if activists are raising awareness of these issues, people are far more likely to come to recognize them and are far more likely to side with environmentalists. But also we can regulate them through the developing world, through the developed world, simply because if America imposes regulations on companies headquartered in America, then those companies can't pollute in the developing world, right? And also, how does affirmative change it? They have no real answer to that. So you have to ask at the end of this, is the government really going to do nothing? Right? Of course the government's going to do something, and of course activists make the government do more. But also, how do they change the behavior of coal mining companies? Because at best on their side, maybe Hooters installs solar panels, but you're never going to be able to reform coal mining companies. They never give an example of how you can restructure a coal mining company to make it good, because there is no way you can make coal mining good. You need external regulations from the government, because otherwise you're going to get sued by your shareholders. Affirmative never comes close to changing the behavior of the very worst polluters. So even if we only have a 5% chance of getting a carbon tax, that easily wins us the debate.
Reply, and I invite affirmative reply to conclude the debate.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Speaker, this opposition team can say that our changes are marginal, that our changes might sometimes be tokenistic, but if they have not given you that path to victory, and if it's just a 1% chance that you're going to get some regulation in some white Swedish country, we would say that is not the comparison that wins them this debate. First reason they lose is because what the hell do they stand for? Second, speaker space, we can buy shareholder shares, we will take a moderate position, we don't have to be so oppositional. And at that point, you must ask yourself, what is this debate? Because at that point, they are also contradictory. At that point, they are making some concessions. And at that point, they are compromising in this debate. So what is indeed do they stand for? Because you can't say we are going to oppose corporations, but we're going to be moderate about it, or we're going to buy some shares and be shareholders. It is our side or yours. Don't cop out of that debate. On that argument alone, they have lost, because I'm not sure if they get any of their benefits in terms of preventing infighting, in terms of preventing hypocrisy, in terms of galvanizing. That shift alone loses them this debate. Second thing, what do they say in terms of principle? The point I brought up with regards to development, most environmentalists bring from the developing world, is to say that this is an active motion that captures a vast majority of them, not the white hippies who hug trees. They can go and fuck off. We say it's a vast majority of developed world people who obviously have the visceral impact of seeing people suffering, of seeing the environmental die. But at the point at which you do nothing, you are guilty by omission, and you will see more visceral things that cause you harm. It is not just you feel bad because you're joining a corporation. In your side, you will feel bad for failing. So this principle is contradictory because of their K-shift. Second, is not mutually exclusive because we better protect it. And third, you are guilty by omission, which means you will see the most visceral and personally painful things, which means as an environmentalist, you are largely principally supposed to do this, which means to minimize the harm in this debate. The second thing, this is where they wholesale lost the debate. You can throw examples of a Biden, and we gave you the reason why your examples don't work, Seamus, is because we gave you structural reasons for why the world is likely to change. Obviously, we think that means in terms of consumer activism, a vast majority of the developing world do not believe in things like, for example, we should be environmentally friendly at the cost of having better economic progress. In the COVID world where there is recession, it is obviously less harder to sell to people that we should do things like hug trees and be principally consistent for nothing. Lobbying, you can lobby all you want to. Corporate lobbying is way stronger. They say strikes and protest works. We gave you structural reasons for why the number of people that go for this are just in Victoria and Melbourne and the richer elites. You require large buy-in from populations, considering the world is right-wing. Bolsonaro, Trump, or like India, Malaysia, name whatever country you want to, you require large-scale approval. You can't just use an example of Biden to compensate the structural analysis we give you for why voting and lobbying and consumer activism don't work. You want government regulations, you require people to vote for them. How on earth do they galvanize these people? That brings me to this part of the debate. How do you galvanize people, right? Because their argument was just, in our world, we'll be seen as hypocrites, we'll be seen as people who splintered the movement. Ask yourself which world splinters the movement more. Is there a world in which you ask people, you pick whether or not you like corporations or criticize them from the outside and join our protest? A vast number of people in the status quo will not do that because they have to work 2 jobs for their children. They have problems that come from things like poverty. Nobody is going to decide we should care about the environment in the future when they are starving now, which means to say, they don't get any change. It's not 5% rotary. It's absolutely fucking zero in terms of what you're likely to get. Now, weigh zero change against our marginal change, right? Because the point in our debate is not we're going to get wholesale approval, right? They are right. The companies that are good are good in both worlds. But in our world, we push them to push the envelope because we add more councils, we add more people in these communities and these corporations to do things like incentivize shareholder activism. Like the point of shareholder activism is that you can get a portion of shares, not a majority of it, and do things like pass special resolutions, do things like push for oppression remedies that change internal structure. But the biggest thing that we want is the structural reasons for why companies will listen to you, which is how do we frame our message? We frame our message as you don't have to be business or environment. You can be business friendly and you can get benefits by being environmentally friendly. Change your profit model. In the short term, maybe you have to pay a cost, but in the future, being environmentally friendly gives you tax benefits. Speaker, debating is about a scale. If we get incremental changes in places where it matters, you don't get people to support you. You don't get a vast number of people to opt into things like protest, lobbying, consumer activism. For all those reasons, on a margin, we have definitely won this debate.
Thank the affirmative reply for their speech and thank all speakers for their speeches. Yeah, thank you very much.